Captain Daniel Carver stood at the center of the grand chamber, surrounded by the towering figures of the Scifi Council. Their sharp, reptilian features glinted under the pale light of the room, their ceremonial armor giving them an imposing aura. Daniel, though used to diplomatic encounters, felt the weight of this meeting pressing heavily on his shoulders. Humanity's place in the galaxy was still new and fragile, and the success of this treaty would determine whether Earth had allies or enemies. The Scifi High Chancellor, a towering figure named Kaler, rose from his seat. His voice was deep and resonant, commanding attention. As a gesture of goodwill, Kaler announced, and as a symbol of our bond, we offer you this. The grand doors to the chamber opened with a dramatic creak. A young Scifi woman stepped through, her posture rigid and proud. She was adorned in traditional garb, her scaled skin shimmering like polished emeralds under the light. Her piercing violet eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Daniel with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. This is Theliera, Kaler said, a noble of our people, gifted to you as a life-bond servant. She will serve you as is our custom, ensuring the strength of our alliance. Daniel's heart sank. He had read about the Scifi customs, but he hadn't expected this. A life-bond servant was, in essence, a slave, bound by ancient tradition to serve without question. To the Scifi, this was a great honor, a sign of trust. But to Daniel, it was unthinkable. Humanity had left such practices behind centuries ago. Chancellor Kaler, Daniel began, carefully measuring his words, your gesture is deeply appreciated. But I must clarify, humans do not believe in owning or enslaving others. It is against our principles. Kaler's expression hardened, and a murmur spread through the council. You insult our customs, Captain Carver, he demanded. Do you reject this gift, this honor? Daniel took a steadying breath. Refusing outright could shatter the fragile negotiations. He needed to tread carefully. I mean no disrespect, he said, his tone calm but firm. I accept Theliera, but I will treat her as an equal, not as a servant. She will have her own freedom aboard my ship. Theliera's eyes widened briefly in surprise before narrowing. She seemed to suppress a scoff, clearly unimpressed by this human kindness. To her, Daniel's words sounded weak and naive. The Scifi valued strength, and she had no intention of being pitied. The meeting concluded with strained smiles and tense handshakes. As Daniel led Theliera toward his ship, he glanced at her. She walked with an air of defiance, her chin held high, her gaze cold. You don't have to follow me, Daniel said quietly, breaking the silence. Theliera stopped, turning to face him. I may not have a choice, she said sharply, her accent making her voice sound both melodic and biting. But do not mistake my presence for submission, human. Daniel sighed. This was going to be a long journey. Theliera stood in the corner of Daniel Carver's ship's command room, arms crossed, her violet eyes scanning the crew with open disdain. The human crew buzzed about, their chatter filling the air with an energy she found strange and unsettling. To her, humans were chaotic creatures, their movements lacking the precision and discipline of her people. And now she was stuck among them. An alien in a foreign world she neither trusted nor respected. Daniel, seated in the captain's chair, glanced at her. You don't have to stand there all day, you know, he said, trying to sound casual. There's a room set aside for you. You can rest. Theliera's gaze shifted to him, sharp and unyielding. I will not rest in your charity, Captain, she replied coolly. I am here because of my people's traditions, not by choice. Daniel suppressed a sigh. He'd dealt with difficult diplomats and stubborn politicians before, but Theliera was something else entirely. Her every word carried an edge, and her pride seemed unshakable. He knew this arrangement was awkward for both of them, but he also knew the success of the treaty, and possibly humanity's future, depended on making it work. Well, Daniel said after a pause, if you're going to be on this ship, you might as well get familiar with it. We're not your enemies, Theliera. She raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. "Your kind believes in freedom, do you not?" she asked, her tone laced with sarcasm. "Yet you trap yourselves in this metal cage, floating in the void." "This metal cage has saved lives," Daniel countered, his patience wearing thin. "And it's more than a cage. It's a symbol of what humans can achieve. Exploration, unity, survival. We don't see limitations. We see possibilities." Philyra's expression flickered for a moment, as if his words had struck a chord, but she quickly masked it with her usual disdain. "Possibilities," she muttered, a convenient excuse for chaos. Before Daniel could respond, a sharp alert rang through the room. The ship's artificial intelligence chimed in. "Captain, we are approaching a debris field. Unidentified wreckage detected." Daniel straightened, his focus shifting instantly. "Status report," he ordered. Philyra watched as the crew moved into action, their movements coordinated despite their apparent lack of rigidity. It was impressive, though she would never admit it aloud. "Scans show remnants of a Scifi vessel," the science officer reported, glancing nervously at Philyra. "It looks recent." Philyra's demeanor changed in an instant. She stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Show me." The screen displayed the wreckage, a shattered ship bearing the unmistakable markings of her people. Her heart tightened. The Scifi were not easily defeated, yet this vessel had been destroyed with precision. It was no accident. Daniel noticed the shift in her expression. For the first time, she looked vulnerable. "Do you recognize it?" he asked gently. Philyra nodded, her voice quieter now. "It is one of our scouting ships. They were patrolling near the border." "Then someone doesn't want peace," Daniel said grimly. "We need to figure out who, and fast." For the first time, Philyra and Daniel's eyes met, and there was no disdain, only an unspoken understanding. Whether they liked it or not, their fates were now intertwined. The tension in the ship's command room was palpable as Daniel Carver stared at the wreckage of the Scifi vessel on the main display. Philyra stood beside him, her usually proud demeanor replaced with a quiet intensity. The sight of the shattered ship stirred something in her: anger, sorrow, and perhaps even fear. "Do you know who could have done this?" Daniel asked, breaking the silence. Philyra shook her head, her voice colder than before. "The Scifi do not fall easily. Whoever attacked this ship knew our weaknesses. This was not a random act of violence. This was deliberate." Daniel folded his arms, his brow furrowed in thought. "If someone's targeting your people, they might also be trying to sabotage the treaty between us. We need answers, and we need them quickly." Philyra's gaze flickered toward him. "You are assuming this involves you, Captain. This could be a matter for the Scifi alone." He met her eyes, unflinching. "If it affects the treaty, it affects humanity. Like it or not, we're in this together." Before Philyra could respond, the ship's AI interrupted. "Captain, unidentified vessel detected approaching at high speed. Estimated time to intercept: 5 minutes." Daniel snapped into action. "Raise shields. Prepare defensive maneuvers." Philyra stepped closer to the display, studying the incoming ship. Her sharp eyes picked up on the details almost immediately. "That is no merchant or scavenger. Look at the formation. It's a Rathok warship." The name sent a chill through the room. The Rathok were a nomadic species known for their ruthless tactics and advanced cloaking technology. They attacked without warning, leaving destruction in their wake. "What are the Rathok doing here?" Daniel muttered. Philyra's expression hardened. "They despise the Concord and everything it stands for. If they are here, it means they found an opportunity to strike at both our peoples." The ship jolted as the first energy blast hit their shields. The crew scrambled to their stations, alarms blaring through the corridors. Daniel's voice cut through the chaos. "Evasive maneuvers. Return fire. Target their engines." Philyra didn't hesitate. She moved to a nearby console, her hands flying across the unfamiliar controls. "Your targeting systems are inefficient," she said, her tone clipped but focused. "Adjust the energy output to disrupt their cloaking systems. It will expose their weak points." Daniel shot her a glance but didn't argue. "Do it." Under Thaliara's guidance, the ship's weapons locked onto the Rathok vessel. A precise blast hit their cloaking system, and the enemy ship shimmered into full visibility. Cheers erupted from the crew, but the battle was far from over. The Rathok returned fire with a vengeance, but Daniel's crew, now working in sync with Thaliara's tactical advice, managed to outmaneuver them. After a tense exchange, a final, well-aimed shot from the human ship disabled the Rathok vessel, forcing it to retreat. As the tension eased, Daniel turned to Thaliara. "I have to admit, you were a big help back there." She lifted her chin, her pride returning. "Do not misunderstand, Captain. I helped because it was necessary for survival, not because I trust you." Daniel smirked, appreciating the honesty. "Fair enough, but maybe this is a start." Thaliara didn't respond, but as she looked at the retreating Rathok ship, a part of her couldn't deny the growing respect she felt for the human captain and his crew. Perhaps they were more than just chaotic beings after all. The aftermath of the battle left the ship buzzing with activity. Engineers hurried to repair minor damages, while the crew exchanged stories of their close call with the Rathok. In the quiet of the observation deck, Captain Daniel Carver found himself standing beside Thaliara. The vast expanse of space stretched before them, stars blinking like distant beacons. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel leaned against the railing, watching Thaliara as she stared out at the stars, her violet eyes thoughtful. She seemed different now, less guarded, though still carrying an air of pride. "You handled yourself well back there," Daniel said finally, breaking the silence. "If you hadn't spotted their weak points, we might not be standing here right now." Thaliara glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Your crew performed admirably, despite your unconventional methods." Daniel chuckled softly. "Unconventional is one way to put it. Humans are good at improvising when things don't go as planned." She tilted her head slightly, a flicker of curiosity crossing her face. "That is what I find strange about your kind. You lack the structure and discipline my people value, yet you still manage to survive and even succeed." "It's not always pretty," Daniel admitted, "but sometimes chaos breeds creativity. We adapt because we have to." Thaliara was silent for a moment, then surprised him with a question. "Were you always this way? Quick to adapt, quick to act?" Daniel hesitated. The question seemed genuine, and for the first time, she wasn't speaking with disdain. "I grew up on Earth, in a small town," he said. "Life wasn't easy, but it taught me to think on my feet. When I joined the space program, I realized that same adaptability was what made us strong as a species." She nodded slowly, her gaze returning to the stars. "My people are taught from birth to follow tradition. We do not question our roles or our purpose. It brings order, but it also limits us. Seeing your crew today, it made me wonder." "Wonder what?" Daniel asked gently. Thaliara hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. Then she spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "If strength comes from discipline, or from something else, something your people have." Daniel smiled. "I think strength comes from both. Discipline gives you the foundation, but adaptability lets you rise to the challenge." Their conversation was interrupted by the ship's eye announcing, "Captain, long-range scans have detected unusual activity near a nearby asteroid field. It may be related to the Rathok." Daniel straightened, his demeanor shifting to command mode. "Looks like we're not done yet." Thaliara's expression hardened, but there was a glimmer of determination in her eyes. "If the Rathok are involved, I will fight alongside you. My people would not forgive another defeat." Daniel nodded. "Good. We'll need your expertise." As they headed to the bridge, Daniel couldn't help but feel that something had shifted between them. For the first time, they weren't just allies by circumstance. They were beginning to understand each other, and that, he thought, was a good start. The ship's lights flickered as it entered the asteroid field. The jagged rocks seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, casting long shadows across the ship's hull. Daniel stood at the helm, his fingers moving rapidly over the control panel as the ship navigated through the dangerous terrain. Thaliara was at his side, her eyes scanning the readouts on the nearby display. "We're not alone," she said quietly, her voice sharp with focus. "There's another ship hiding in the shadows. It's not the Rathok. It's different." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Different how?" "It's too well hidden," Thaliara replied. "The ship is using an advanced cloaking system, something more sophisticated than what the Rathok typically use." "Could it be another faction?" Daniel asked, his suspicion growing. Thaliara's expression hardened. "I don't know, but I've seen these types of cloaks before. They're used by a secretive group within the Scifi. They've been working against the Concord for some time." Daniel glanced at her, his surprise evident. "You're saying there are traitors within your own people?" Thaliara's eyes met his, full of an emotion Daniel couldn't quite place. "Yes, there are factions who believe the Concord is weak, that an alliance with humanity will bring ruin to Scifi traditions. They would rather see us fall than allow this peace to last." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. The Scifi had always seemed like a powerful, united people, but now he realized that, like any race, they had their divisions. "So this is bigger than just the Rathok," he said. "We're dealing with a conspiracy." Thaliara nodded grimly. "Exactly. And they've been waiting for the right moment to strike." Just as the words left her lips, a sudden explosion shook the ship. The lights dimmed, and alarms blared across the bridge. Daniel gripped the edge of the console, his heart racing. "Shields are holding," the officer at the tactical station reported, but his voice was tense. "We're being targeted by multiple energy blasts." "We've got company," Daniel muttered under his breath. "Activate evasive maneuvers. Return fire." As the ship swerved to avoid more blasts, Daniel could see the shadow of the cloaked ship emerging from behind an asteroid. It was sleek, far more advanced than the Rathok vessel, and it moved with precision. Whoever these attackers were, they were no ordinary pirates. Thaliara was already at the weapons console, her hands moving quickly. "We need to disable their cloaking system first," she said. "I can't target them if they keep hiding." Daniel nodded. "Do it." With expert precision, Thaliara adjusted the ship's energy output, focusing it into a concentrated beam. The blast hit the cloaked ship dead center, sending ripples of energy through its hull. For a moment, the ship shimmered into full visibility, revealing its sharp, angular design, one that Daniel recognized as a Scifi military vessel. "This isn't just a group of rebels," Daniel said, realization dawning on him. "This is a faction within your military." Thaliara's face twisted in disgust. "They would destroy everything to maintain their hold on power. We have to stop them, or the peace is lost." Daniel's jaw clenched. "And I will make sure we do." As the two ships exchanged fire, Daniel's mind raced. The truth was clear now. The threat wasn't just external. The battle for peace was more complicated than he had imagined, and the closer they got to the heart of the conspiracy, the more dangerous it would become. The battle raged on as Daniel Carver's ship and the mysterious Scifi vessel exchanged fire. Sparks flew across the hull, and the ship's engines hummed under the strain of evasive maneuvers. The crew worked like a well-oiled machine, following Daniel's commands with precision. But all the while, his mind kept returning to the bigger picture. The Scifi military faction that was trying to sabotage the peace. Thaliara stood beside him, her sharp eyes constantly scanning the battle. Her usual pride and defiance were gone, replaced by an intensity Daniel hadn't seen before. She was no longer just a reluctant ally. She was a soldier, fighting for something far more personal. "We're losing power to the forward shields," one of the engineers called out. "Get them back online now," Daniel ordered, his voice firm. Phileura stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the controls. "Captain," she said urgently, "their weapon systems are targeting our weak points. If we don't disable their main reactor, we'll never survive this." Daniel turned to her, his expression grim. "Then let's do it." He didn't hesitate to follow her lead, trusting her instincts completely. Under her direction, the ship adjusted its course and locked onto the Scifi vessel's reactor. The next few minutes felt like an eternity, with both ships locked in a deadly dance of fire and evasive maneuvers. "Ready when you are," Daniel said. Phileura nodded. "Fire." The concentrated blast hit the Scifi ship's reactor with pinpoint accuracy, sending a shockwave through its systems. The ship faltered, its cloaking technology flickering out of existence. For a moment, they had the upper hand. But then, just as the Scifi vessel started to retreat, a new transmission came through. It was from the Scifi warship itself, a direct communication to Daniel's ship. The voice that spoke through the static was familiar to Phileura, cold, commanding, and unmistakable. "Phileura," the voice said, "you have betrayed us." Phileura's face went pale. She stepped closer to the comms, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "Uncle Kaler." Kaler, the Scifi High Chancellor, the man who had given her to Daniel as a gift, was now the voice of the conspiracy. His betrayal stung, but what followed was worse. "You are a traitor to your own people. You choose humans over your own kind. You are nothing more than a pawn in their game." Phileura's fists clenched. "I choose peace. I choose freedom. You and your faction are blinded by pride and tradition." Daniel could feel the tension in the room, the weight of Phileura's words hanging in the air. The voice of Kaler grew colder, more threatening. "You may have sided with the humans, but remember this. No matter where you go, you will never escape your bloodline. You will never escape us." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the bridge in stunned silence. Phileura stood frozen for a moment, as though the weight of her family's betrayal had crushed her spirit. Daniel watched her, knowing there was more to this than she was willing to admit. "You don't have to do this alone," Daniel said softly, his voice unwavering. "We'll stop them together." Phileura looked at him, her eyes fierce but tinged with sadness. "I have no choice now," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I will stop them, or they will destroy everything we've worked for." Daniel nodded, his expression determined. He had seen her strength before, but now it was personal. For the first time, Phileura wasn't just an ally. She was family, and he would fight by her side, no matter the cost. The ship hummed with quiet energy as the crew made necessary repairs, but the weight of the battle lingered in the air. Daniel Carver stood at the window of the observation deck, staring out at the stars. The Scifi warship was now disabled, but the threat was far from over. His thoughts were on Phileura, who had returned to her quarters after the confrontation with her uncle, Kaler. Daniel didn't know what to expect when he had accepted Phileura onto his ship, but he never imagined it would lead to something like this. The events of the past few days had changed everything. She wasn't just a reluctant guest from another world. She was a warrior, a person with a past, a future, and a reason to fight. A reason that had become deeply personal. He was startled from his thoughts when the door to the observation deck slid open. He turned to find Phileura standing in the doorway, her eyes holding a deep weariness. Her proud posture was still there, but it was softened by the weight of the emotion she had been carrying. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice quieter than usual, "about what you said before, about strength coming from both discipline and adaptability." Daniel raised an eyebrow, surprised she had taken his words to heart. "I'm glad you've been thinking about it. It's not just a random theory. Humans have learned to survive because we have to adapt to everything life throws at us." Phileura stepped closer, her gaze never leaving him. "I never realized how much I took my own people's traditions for granted. Everything was so clear to me before. We followed orders, we did our duty, and that was enough. But now, Everything is so uncertain. Tradition can be important, Daniel said, his voice gentle, but it shouldn't come at the cost of freedom. And sometimes, it's okay to question things, to break away when something isn't right. She nodded slowly, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. I've had to question everything. And now I don't know who I'm supposed to be. Daniel turned to face her fully, his voice firm. You're not alone in this. You've made a choice, and it's a brave one. But you don't have to face the consequences of it alone. Philiora's lips twitched in the faintest of smiles. You speak as though you have no choice. I've never known a human to accept anything without question. He chuckled, the tension in the room easing for a moment. We question everything, all the time. It's what keeps us going. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the quiet stretching between them. Then Philiora spoke again, her voice softer this time. I don't know if I can ever fully leave behind my people, my family. But I know I can't let them destroy the future we're trying to build. Daniel met her gaze, his expression sincere. Then we'll build it together. As partners. There was something in her eyes then. Something new. A flicker of hope, perhaps, or maybe it was trust. She had fought alongside him, risked everything. And now she was starting to see him not just as the captain of a ship, but as someone who truly understood her. For the first time since meeting her, Daniel saw a glimpse of what they could become. Two people, from different worlds, standing together, ready to face whatever came next. We make a good team, she said, her voice stronger now. He nodded. The best team. As the two stood together, looking out at the vastness of space, something unspoken passed between them. They had crossed many barriers, cultural, emotional, and personal, and in doing so, had begun to build something far greater than just an alliance. They were starting to become something more. Together, they would face whatever came next. Together, they would fight for a future worth believing in. The space around them was quiet after the battle. The Scifi warship that had attacked them was now drifting silently in the void, its systems failing after their successful strike. But despite the victory, Daniel Carver couldn't shake the feeling that the real fight was still to come. The conspiracy within the Scifi, led by Philiora's uncle Kaler, was not over. In fact, it was only just beginning to unfold. Philiora had spent the past few hours in her quarters, reflecting on everything that had happened. Daniel didn't know what was going through her mind, but he could guess. The weight of her family's betrayal was a heavy burden, one that she carried alone. He wasn't about to let her face it alone. As captain, it was his responsibility to lead, but as someone who had come to trust and respect her, it was also his duty to stand beside her, no matter what. The soft sound of footsteps brought his attention back to the present. He turned and saw Philiora stepping onto the bridge, her face set in determination. Despite everything she had been through, she looked ready to face whatever challenge lay ahead. Captain, she said, her voice steady, we have to find out more about Kaler's plans. He won't stop until he has total control over the Scifi. We can't let that happen. Daniel nodded, his gaze meeting hers. I agree, but we can't act rashly. We need information, and we need to find the people who are still loyal to the Concord. Philiora took a deep breath, her shoulders squared. I know where to look. There's a hidden base on the outskirts of the Scifi-controlled territory. It's where the true loyalists are hiding, those who still believe in peace and cooperation with humanity. And you think we can trust them? Daniel asked. Yes, she replied without hesitation. These are my people, the ones who didn't agree with my uncle's way of thinking. They won't betray us, but we need to get there before Kaler's faction does. If they find it first, they'll destroy it. Daniel turned to his crew, giving orders. Prepare the ship for immediate departure. We're heading for the outskirts of Scifi space. The crew moved quickly, responding to his command with practiced efficiency. But as Daniel watched them, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision ahead. This wasn't just about stopping a conspiracy. It was about choosing sides, about deciding what kind of future they would all fight for. For Thylaera, it was personal. And for him, it had become personal too. As the ship began to move toward the Skireni border, Daniel stepped up to the controls. He could feel the tension in the air, the uncertainty of the mission hanging over them. But there was also a sense of resolve, a sense that they were doing the right thing. The battle for peace, for freedom, wasn't just a matter of winning or losing. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. Thylaera stood by his side, her gaze fixed on the stars ahead. For the first time, Daniel saw a hint of hope in her eyes. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was he. They were partners in this fight, and together, they would face whatever came next. "We're ready," she said, her voice firm. Daniel nodded, a small smile crossing his face. "Then let's make sure we get to them before Kaler does." As the ship surged forward into the unknown, Daniel couldn't help but feel that this was the turning point, the moment where everything would change. They were no longer just two people caught in the middle of a war. They were a team, fighting for a future that no one could take away from them. The journey to the hidden base was long, and the tension on the ship only grew as they neared the Skireni-controlled space. Daniel Carver stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the shifting stars ahead. It had been days since their last confrontation with the Skireni military, and the silence that had followed felt unnatural. The calm before the storm, Daniel thought. Thylaera was still on edge, and Daniel could feel it every time their paths crossed. The weight of her family's betrayal was heavy, and she had spent much of the journey alone in her quarters. But every now and then, she would emerge, her eyes sharper, more determined than ever. She knew what was at stake, and Daniel had come to respect her resolve. "Captain," the voice of the communications officer interrupted his thoughts. "We've reached the outskirts of Skireni space, scanning for the base. Do we have any sign of enemy ships?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the growing tension in his chest. "Not yet, but we should proceed cautiously. The base is in a heavily guarded sector." Daniel nodded. "Proceed with caution. Everyone be ready for anything." As the crew went to their stations, Daniel found himself walking toward the observation deck. He needed a moment to think, to process everything that had happened. It had been a whirlwind. Discovering the conspiracy, standing alongside Thylaera against her own people, and now racing to prevent a war that could tear both of their worlds apart. When he entered the observation room, he wasn't surprised to find Thylaera standing there, looking out at the stars. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her face serious but calm. "You're quiet," she said, her voice low. "You're thinking about the mission." Daniel gave a small nod, walking up beside her. "Yeah, it's hard not to. But I've been thinking about something else too." Thylaera raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "And what's that?" He hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "About us, about everything we've been through. This mission, it's changed things." She didn't respond immediately, her eyes studying him with an unreadable expression. He could tell that her thoughts were far away, lost in the turmoil of the past few days. But still, she gave him the time to continue. "I've never faced anything like this before," Daniel said, his voice more vulnerable than he intended. "But what I know is that I trust you. I trust you to have my back, and I want you to know that I'm here for whatever comes next." Thylaera was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the stars once more. Then, slowly, she turned toward him. "And what if I told you that I don't know where I belong anymore? My people, my family, they've betrayed everything I believed in. I thought I was strong, but now—" Her voice trailed off, and Daniel could see the uncertainty in her eyes. He stepped closer, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you know, and you've already proven that by choosing to fight for what's right, not for what's easy. I've seen that strength, and I admire it." For a moment, there was silence between them, a connection growing that neither could deny. Finally, Daniel spoke again, his voice quiet but sincere. "Phyliora," he said, his heart beating faster now. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I know I want to face it with you. Not just as a captain and an ally, but as something more." Phyliora looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. Her usual stoic expression softened, and for the first time, she seemed unsure of herself. "Are you asking me?" she began, her voice trailing off. "Yes," Daniel said, his voice steady now. "I'm asking you to be with me, in whatever comes next. Together." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Phyliora placed a hand on his. "You are human," she said quietly, "and I am Scifi. But perhaps this is where we find our strength, in what we are, and in what we can become." A quiet smile crossed Daniel's face. "I think so." In that moment, standing together in the silence of space, both of them realized something. They weren't just fighting for a treaty or for peace between their people anymore. They were fighting for each other. And in that fight, they had already won. The hidden base on the outskirts of Scifi space had been more than just a safe haven. It had been a symbol of resistance. As Daniel Carver and Phyliora's ship entered the base's quiet, protected atmosphere, a sense of finality settled over them. The conspiracy within the Scifi had been unraveled, and the traitors who had once threatened the fragile peace were now exposed. But the cost had been high. Many lives had been lost in the struggle, and the road to peace was far from smooth. Inside the base, the atmosphere was calm but tense. Loyalists who had stood by Phyliora and the Concord now gathered in small groups, discussing what came next. The leaders of the resistance, the people who had fought to protect the alliance between humans and Scifi, were ready to rebuild, but it was clear that trust would need to be earned all over again. Daniel stood beside Phyliora, looking out across the base's expansive interior. The stars twinkled through the large observation windows, as if mocking the calm that had returned after so much chaos. He could feel the weight of the decisions they had made, of the new life that awaited them both. They had won, but the real challenge was just beginning. "How do we rebuild after all this?" Daniel asked quietly, turning to her. "How do we fix the damage that's been done?" Phyliora stood still for a moment, her gaze focused on the distant stars, her face set with determination. "We start by trusting again," she said, her voice steady. "The Scifi who fought for peace, they are not the ones who have failed us. It is those who refuse to change, those who cling to old ways. But the future is ours now. We have to lead by example, show everyone that peace is worth fighting for." Daniel nodded, his hand resting on the console beside him. "And we'll do it together. I don't know how long it'll take, but I believe in it, and I believe in us." She looked at him, her expression softer than it had been in days. There was still uncertainty in her eyes, but also a glimmer of hope, something that had been missing for so long. "I never thought I would find myself here, Daniel," she said, her voice quiet, almost vulnerable. "Fighting for something I can believe in. Fighting for us." Daniel stepped closer to her, his heart racing. "I never thought I'd be standing here either. But I'm glad I am. I'm glad you're with me." Phyliora looked at him for a long moment, as though considering her next words carefully. Then, with a small smile, she reached out, placing her hand on his. "Together, we'll make this work. Together, we'll show them that we can build a future where we're not divided by our differences, but stronger because of them." Daniel squeezed her hand, feeling the warmth of her resolve. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles to fight, more challenges to face. But they were no longer just two people from different worlds. They were partners, allies, and more than that, together, they were a symbol of what could be achieved when people set aside their differences and worked for a common goal. As the two of them stood there, hand in hand, looking out at the stars, the future seemed a little less uncertain. They had chosen to fight, and in that choice, they had found each other. They were no longer just fighting for peace between their peoples. They were fighting for each other. And in that fight, they had already won. The future was theirs to build, together.